All right, I've got your screen. You're sharing your screen, so the wonders of modern technology.
Except that I can't see it, which is also one of the wonders. There we go.
That would be the limitations of modern technology.
Yeah.
All right. I've got 11:31, and on the adjusted schedule, we got 11:30 start. So, Andrew, we're gonna hand it over to you to take control. My one sort of lesson learned from the first session is I'm going to keep everybody open as active speakers, and then ask you to self-mute if you are not talking, and that way it'll limit any background noise and feedback and interference that may happen. Sound good? All right, so I'm going to self-mute and follow my own instructions. And Andrew, take it away, and let's have at it.
Sure. I'm a retired transportation consultant, and in my retirement in June, I was appointed as Billerica representative on the Lowell Regional Transit Authority. The Lowell Regional Transit Authority is one of the 15 regional transit authorities which provide transit service and senior citizen service outside of the MBTA district. And the Lowell Authority is made up of a number of cities and towns. I think there are 14, 7 of which have fixed bus route service, and all of them have subsidies from the Transit Authority for senior center services. When COVID-19 hit, that really changed things. We're actually discouraging passengers unless they are on essential trips. We've given up collection of fares so that people can board in the center of the buses unless they need the ramp capabilities at the front of the bus for wheelchair access or whatever. We've had a few employees that have contracted, drivers who've contracted COVID-19, and it's a challenge. And what I've begun to think about is not so much what to do now as one of the members of the board of directors, but what should we be doing and trying to do after we set a new normal. And to sort of brainstorm as to what we should be doing and how we should be doing it, I've put together 3 slides here. It was done in about 20 minutes, saying what the challenges of transit systems, and particularly the small transit systems, are. And long-term, whether we're large or small, the transit systems are challenged by employment moving away from the transit hubs. Or about 20 years ago, the Lowell Regional Transit Authority was basically, we don't want your buses on the downtown, parking on the downtown streets while you're waiting, so the hub got moved out to the commuter rail station, which is a good 20, 25-minute walk from downtown. And as life is changing, we're going to smaller households. We've got growing numbers of households with 2 or more cars. There's been a shift away from 9-to-5 jobs. More of the jobs are gig jobs that don't require daily commutes, or that they shift locations, like my son-in-law's electrician job. He may work at one construction site for even 8 or 9 months, but then he's off to a different one, so he doesn't have a consistent travel pattern. We've seen leakage of ridership to new competitors, and these are interesting challenges for the transit systems because they are higher service, higher cost services, and we just can't compete on a service levels. And also probably the largest growth area in transit in North America is the corporate and university transit systems, which are drawing passengers from the and riders from the traditional services. To add to these generic long-term problems that have meant that our ridership is in a gradual decline, at least as far as bus riders are concerned, in the short term, we've got a lot less congestion on the road so that when people start going back to work, they can fly relatively to what they've experienced between home and job. There are lower gas prices, which make things a lot less cost for the auto commuters. We have introduced crowding on our transit services. There's a perceived risk. There's some noise in the background that's not coming from me. There's a perceived higher health risk of shared transport. We've lost a lot of fare revenue and will continue to lose that. And for example, the Lowell Regional Transit Authority gets about 75% of its funding from government sources, and there's increased competition for funds that have been traditionally used to fund services. And in particular for the small transit systems, the alternative modes have lower cost. If you're talking about getting to Lawrence or Lowell, your parking charges are a lot less. There's less congestion on many of the routes. There's less transit density, which means both higher operating costs and lower fare box recovery ratios. There's the perception that riders are people, those poor people who have to use the system. And with a lower percentage of voters using the system, there's less political support. So that's anyone who's got anything to add to these challenges, I'd love to see it. And then I'd love to see a discussion as to how we need to change in order to survive and meet all those diverse goals that people have set for the smaller transit systems, of helping out on reducing emissions and climate change, doing economic development, providing necessary social service, providing the opportunity for people to get to many social services. I mean, I'd hate to be the transit administrator because he's just got so many objectives that he's got to meet that it's almost impossible for him to do so. So I'll open it up. First, probably we should talk about whether there are any challenges that people see offhand that I have missed here.
I don't remember you talking a lot about, I mean, you talked some about the loss of fare box revenue, but the related challenge to that is loss of other sources of revenue, state contributions, federal contributions, local contributions. As you know, state budgets are hit pretty hard by this in most places, and local budgets from tax revenue. So that's going to compound some of the issues with the fare, but it also could affect capital. A lot of that money is capital money, particularly from the feds, and that money could get affected as well.
It's definitely a worry. Again, we go for about in the Lowell Transit Authority, and each state and metropolitan area has different ways of funding, but in our particular situation, a quarter of our funding comes from the cities and towns we serve, and fortunately it comes on a legislated formula, so we can pretty well count on that money. The federal pass-throughs provide about another 25%. Direct state funding is a little more than 25%, percent because we got a grant for Sunday service, which has been canceled for the duration of the crisis, but that brought things up to more than a quarter from the state. And we get about 10% of our recovery from our management of 2 commuter rail stations and 10% from fares. So yeah, the long-term concern is whether the governmental entities that fund us will be able to maintain their current level of funding. It's interesting, if you're a large agency, the loss of fare revenues is a more immediate and important hit than it was for us as a small transit agency.
Andrew, when you talk about fare box recovery rates and the immediate hit and stuff, I think large like the MTA, large organizations, they have fare box recovery rates below 50%, and they have very large fixed cost expenses in both terms of their equipment and their labor because of union contracts and so forth. How does that impact the small and medium transit system that you're talking about? What is your fare box recovery rate, and what's your cost structure like?
Going to the transit profiles, we've got on the Lowell Transit Authority for our fixed route services, probably about a 15% fare recovery ratio, and that's about half of the fare recovery ratio for the MBTA's bus operation. So we clearly aren't as good as a larger agency. Now, again, when the regional transit authorities in Massachusetts were set up, and so other states will have a different answer to your question, we were required to contract out all of our services. So we have a paid staff of just about 5 people total, and everything else is contracted out. So there is some ability to change the contract payments as the level of service changes, but basically most of our expenses are pretty well fixed for the duration of the contracts. We have 2 contracts, one for the fixed route services and one for the paratransit services.
So, related to what you're talking about before on the challenge related to cost, I wonder if that assessment of the cost factors in all of the costs of driving. And what I mean by that is the IRS pegs the cost of driving at, 58 cents a mile? And so if we're talking about the costs of driving versus transit, that feels like the cost we should be using to make that calculation. If you make that 58 cents per mile calculation, the ratio between cost of driving and cost of transit looks very different.
Yeah, you've got an interesting, I mean, we think of transit as having a lot of fixed route or fixed cost components, but actually the perceived cost of driving, once you have committed to a vehicle, the tendency is to think that your marginal cost of using that vehicle are simply gas, tolls, and parking. And so the decision of whether to use transit and or auto is one where the perceived costs are usually much less than that 58 cents a mile.
Yeah, and I guess that's the point I'm getting at, is the difference between perceived cost and actual cost. People talk about, when they talk about the cost of driving, they only talk about the perceived costs, but I use this as an example of this. I was talking online with somebody about commuting from Philadelphia to Malvern here in Philadelphia, which is about 22 miles, and it's an $18 round, about $18 round trip train ticket. If you do 55 cents per mile driving times 50 miles is like $25 or $28. Whereas if you just calculate it in gas, it would be way less than that.
Between this, I mean, in light density areas, transit has real challenges because of that perception, and it's not an incorrect perception. If you're going to if you think that you need a car for other purposes, your marginal costs, which is are significantly less than, because that 58 cents a mile includes an awful lot of fixed costs which don't change by the amount of mileage you drive. So, I mean, really, you have to think, in order to really market your transit effectively, that you're eliminating the cost of the second or third car in a household, and not that the per trip cost, because as you state quite often, that the marginal cost of a transit trip, even though it's highly subsidized, is higher than the marginal cost of the auto trip.
That's true. I guess my only real point is that in talking about the comparison of costs, we need to make sure that we figure in all of the costs involved in driving, not just the ones that people directly pay for. Not just the direct cost that people see, which is every time they take a trip, which is the gas and the mileage, but transit has to cover fixed costs too. So.
Yeah, so we've got a situation where ideally, if the COVID-19 had not hit, I would have been advocating for longer hours of service so that we could meet shift workers' needs at places. And one of the biggest employers in the region are the hospitals. And to be more effective, probably work out our connections with the MBTA better, so that there are more effective service. Maybe do a little work with some of the regional transit authorities. See if we could use some of the assets that are assigned to the senior centers for commuters also. Raise the parking fees at the parking lot, which is full every morning by 7:30, to become a more viable operations. But now there's no fare revenue, there's no parking revenue, and so what do? Do I cut service? What's the appropriate response that I should be making? or any transit authority should be making.
Go ahead.
No, okay. I was going to ask you, well, what are the decision parameters? What are you trying to, accomplish? And, I mean, I found that helpful is if I understand what the criteria for the decision is, the decision comes to the surface more readily than sort of trying to start backwards.
The state in 2019 took a careful look at the regional transit authorities because they felt that they weren't getting good returns in service for the bucks they were paying. And the goals that the transit authorities are trying to achieve are not clear. There are multiple goals which are conflicting. So I'd love somebody to say what those goals were. But this is a political entity which has got to balance total costs of the service. It's got to balance the needs of those people who are dependent on the service. It's got to convince voters through that we are a value to them by providing things like lower emissions per rider than if the service didn't exist. There are people who dream that putting people onto the small transit systems helps congestion, but quite honestly, most of the congestion in our region is on the interstate quality highways, and we have no operations which really serve the origins and destinations that the people on the highway are for those trips. It's impossible to take public transit from the Massachusetts over the border to New Hampshire, even though that would be a very logical route. There are a few transit services that get you from New Hampshire to Boston, but they bypass the small transit agencies area entirely.
In relation to what to do, you mentioned like having service that's more useful for shift workers, and from my perspective, that's the important approach, especially now. If you look at the kinds of workers who are still having to commute places, tend to be shift workers, hospitals, grocery stores, public services, somewhat less so, like police, firefighter, that kind of thing. But those are heavily shift-oriented businesses where people still have to get to and from where they're going, and a certain number of the workers in both those demographics tend to be in the economic bracket that's more reliant on transit. But I think that's related to one of the, I'm someone who rides transit every day, and one of the things, and you see this in the places that have had success with their bus service and keeping ridership flat or growing it, a lot of it is about, is it useful service? And that's, that's not necessarily a super clear-cut answer, but kind of the things I mean is like, are the frequencies on the routes that go past businesses reasonable? Are the connections for those shift workers, do the connections work for those shift workers so that they can reasonably take that bus back to whatever population center they're going to? Our reliability is secondary, but also related to that. I think to me that's the big question is big key in looking at service right now is it useful to the people who still have to ride it? Because at this point, the only people who are going to be riding trains are people who have to because they're still going to jumps. So is the service serving the places where those workers have to go?
It's an interesting challenge. Again, I don't have statistics, but my instincts say that the small, prior to people's sheltering in place, that the small transit operations generally did not peak to the same extent as the big transit operations, because we have as many higher percentage of our trips for grocery shopping, appointments, social visits, and things of that nature than job-related trips. Now that's changed, of course, with the current situation. But we have very few cases of crowded buses. The one that I have the most experience in, I don't have a job, so my use of it, although I used the transit authority that I'm on the board of directors a couple of times a week, it was most often not at rush hour, but we do have crowded buses at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, which is earlier than what the traditional big transit agency is. We have one surge that comes from high school students. So, yeah, making ourselves essential was a problem before and will continue to be a problem. But from a transit management point of view, what the solution has been for most small transit agencies is generally level service throughout the day, with buses which are relatively more full at the peak time and relatively few passengers at times. But because you've got a driver who's going to work for 6 to 10 hours, the fact that he's got 1 or 2 busy trips, you don't save much by not running the less busy trips until you can actually say, I'm going to cut out, make major cuts and change routes. What other experience do people have with some of the small transit agencies?
I think your point about the school kids is a good one, because I've worked with a small agency in California that ran special tripper service just for the schools. And of course, now that the schools are closed, they don't need to run that service anymore. So yeah, I think that a lot of the things you highlighted about usage are relevant to other small agencies as well. And I don't know how much changes to, I don't know how many people you have connecting to the T at the rail stations, and obviously that ridership's dropped off a cliff like it has everywhere else. So I don't know how much that's affected demand profiles on some routes either.
The relationships with the big agencies are always interesting, and there's no good mechanism to say how many people do transfer. And I know I live in Billerica, and one of the two stations that we manage is the North Billerica station, which is a 12-minute walk from my house. And that has gone from a station which is, the bus service on the two routes which do stop at the station aren't well coordinated with the train schedules, and there are very few passengers which transfer. At the Lowell station, my sense is there are a lot of passengers that transfer, but we have no sense of how many are coming on buses and how many are parking in the parking garage at the station, because the fare card that we use for, they call it the Charlie card, is not accepted on commuter rail. So there's a separate fare collection mechanism on commuter rail, and we have no idea of how many people transfer. Anybody else use small transit agencies before the shutdown?
Unfortunately, not me, Andrew. Can't help you out. I'm a Suburban Philadelphia resident. I am a transit user. I much prefer to take the train into the city from where I live in the suburbs. And on my often trips into Manhattan, pre-C-19, I would use a combination of New Jersey Transit and the MTA once I got into Manhattan. So I tend to be a big transit authority user. I'm not. I think because I live in one of the 5 counties in suburban Philadelphia, we're covered by the same transit organization, which is SEPTA, the Southeast Pennsylvania Transit Authority. I think some of the challenges you talk about, I would see further out in what's called Berks County, or into the Lehigh Valley, where there's just 3 cities of Bethlehem, and the demographics of Bethlehem and Easton and Allentown are probably similar to, but maybe even a little larger than what you see in the Lowell and Lawrence area. What I find intriguing is that you have 14 small transit systems in the suburbs of Boston. Is that correct?
No. In the state, there are 15 regional transit authorities.
Okay.
Pioneer Valley in the center of the state is geographically the largest. The smallest are the ones on the islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. Okay. Our transit district is composed of, I think, 14 towns, 7 of which have a fixed bus route service. And the others are members so that they can get the senior center transit service subsidies.
Okay.
What kind of coordination has been happening with the other small and mid-sized transit agencies in Massachusetts, or have you reached out to any of the ones across the border in New Hampshire to talk about what's going on, or if there are places where you intersect to try and coordinate things? Have there been conversations like that happening?
I'm on the board of directors, and I'm not privy to the conversations that the administrator might be having. But for all practical purposes, there are no conversations across state lines. One of the results of this 2019 study that I mentioned was a supposed reactivation of a coordinating body of the regional transit authorities with MassDOT chairing. But as I go on to that organization's website, there are no scheduled meetings. So I don't think we're in the middle of a budget process, We have had no guidelines from the state yet as to what we should expect on their 25% of the budget funding for the next fiscal year. They are obviously in a crisis mode, and even in terms of the MassDOT budget, the regional transit authorities are relatively small. I think the total statewide funding for all of the regional transit authorities was $80 million. The Lowell Regional Transit Authority's budget was only about $14 million. And so compare that, I mean, we're hardly noticed in comparison with the MBTA or the Mass Turnpike Authority or the other responsibilities that Mass DOT has. So I think to a degree we're out on our own.
Well, I think in terms of funding-wise, how you raised this a little bit earlier, but money coming from the Fed and the state is not something that I would count on. Certainly not at the level. I mean, what I find intriguing, and I understand it from a political standpoint, all the organizations are lining up and making the case that they should be made whole. That has a price to pay, and that's a multi-trillion-dollar price. And the question is, well, you can't just sit in the basement in D.C. and run the printing press of the money machine without having ramifications. So, if you were to make a budget or plan on that, you've got to manage your costs and your deliverables and your revenue. Are you looking at significant service cuts, like no Sunday service or no Saturday service? What's your strategy to respond?
That hasn't been developed yet. Now, the steps that we have taken in the short term is basically gone to a Saturday-like schedule. We just started earlier, within the last 12 months, the Sunday service under a grant from the Mass DOT, which was separate from the other funding, and that has been canceled. But, here we are in, government comes up with interesting government procedures, and here we are with a board of directors of about 16, which clearly each one of the members of the board have different parochial interests. Each one of the 7 towns with a fixed bus route service are probably going to say, don't cut mine, or if you cut mine, make sure my contribution from the town drops accordingly. So, it's an interesting governance structure to work within. Again, I'm glad I'm not the administrator who has to listen to the various points of view.
Well, yeah. I don't mean to laugh and be dismissive, but you've got mixed motive. You're trying to work in a non-zero-sum, mixed motive world, which, neurologically speaking, humans aren't designed to work with. So, welcome to my world.
And your world is, I've forgotten.
Yeah, I'm a consultant, what most people call it, but my area of specialization is I'm a collaboration architect. So how do you take this group of people from we each think to we agree to do to we're going to go do it and get it done? And those discrete pieces are very difficult. The we each think has limitations because there's things we will and won't say, and then that stuff that doesn't get spoken ends up being buried cost to mitigate it once you implement. So, my space is how do you get a more valid opinion data set and then mitigate that as you go forward. So your point, like you said, you have 16 people on your advisory board. You likely have very little idea where the alignment and misalignment exists.
That's true. And the other thing about it, from my other transportation experience, I started out in the railroad industry when it was a disaster. And from my experience is that when you have even just a little bit of growth, it's a lot easier to manage than when you have shrinkage. This is not a time where we're going to see any growth whatsoever, and the transit industry as a whole is not going to see any growth. I mean, what did it take after 9/11? About 6 years for the subway ridership to come back to the same levels as it was before, and that wasn't a situation where you're looking at the passengers 3 feet away from you and asking if they're coughing.
Right. At that point, I heard the airline industry is planning out at 2025 before they return to pre-C-19 performance levels. So I would not be surprised if you see transit in a similar world, because we're also habitualizing new behaviors. More and more people have the opportunity to work at home, and are they going to return to the office, or are they going to return to the office at some decreased amount? That they're only going to the office half the time or 40% of the time before. Transit agencies, whether they're, this is my opinion, whether they're large or small like yours or large ones like the MTA or Boston's or something, their budgets are so tight that they can't really absorb a drop of 5% or 7% or maybe even 3% in ridership without having to stick their hands up and say, help me. All right. Well, does anybody have any other comments? No? Well, we're at 12:13, so let's close this panel 2 minutes early. Is that good? And thank Andrew for sharing his experiences with the Lowell Regional Transit Authority and bringing up some provocative ideas and sharing, lack of better description, some of the pain that's going on in the industry at the moment. So thank you, Andrew.
You're welcome.